everybody, to episode 78 of Everything Teams Phone Live. It is 78. Why are your hands in the air?
Your mic just completely cut out. We didn't even hear the jingle.
Even Holly decided, I don't want Rick's jingle anymore. The sound canceling kicked in. It's like, I'm done. And we've heard this 78 times now. I thought
is it still on? Is it on?
Oh, we hear you.
Oh, yeah, we hear you.
We hear you. I think you just came on so loud and aggressively that your sound canceling, your noise canceling on your poly bar.
It thought it was music. It thought it was music, and so it just canceled it out. That's what happened.
Hold on a second. Episode 78 of Everything Teams Phone Live. Here we are. Matt Carlson joins us again for the third. Is it the third already? Is it the third or fourth? For the third show in a 5-show series to talk about a massive migration. What does that look like? Again, we're doing this for the enterprises out in the world that want to understand how they can successfully migrate to Microsoft Teams Phone and really the why. Today I'm excited because we're going to get to the why, okay? Matt's going to help us set up a cadence. We're going to see what that looks like because to talk about all the stuff that we left off from last week. We'll cover that again, but I know Brandon, we've got some things to talk about. Bailey, we've got some housekeeping to do. We're still sponsored. Amazingly, we're still sponsored. It's fantastic. And Matt, welcome back. So let's do those things first, and we'll kick this thing off.
Sure thing. You guys know this podcast is sponsored by Momentum, where we help businesses connect, collaborate, and engage using Microsoft Teams. Now back to episode 78 with none other than Matt Carlson.
Thanks, Bailey. And Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Great to have you here again. I keep thinking about this in the back of my mind. This has nothing to do with the content of the show, but I kind of keep like a mental record of like who's like been on the show the most. And I think you're going to take the crown maybe by the time we're done with this series, but not only the most, but how quickly you did it, right? Speed to first place.
SNL has like that 5 timers jacket. Am I going to get one of those?
Yeah, we might have to get you one. Yeah.
There you go. No, it's going to be a crown. It's going to be a girly crown.
I need a smoking jacket.
It's going to be a tiara. We're going to send you a tiara, Matt. It's an ETPL tiara. Oh, that's hilarious. Brandon, with 5 times, I think you're right. I think that may be pretty darn close to the top of the list. Although Tom Arbuthnot, I think Tom and Jason from Microsoft may be right at that 5. Yeah, it's out of 78 shows. You'd think we have to invite them at some point, just like, to bring some real experts on the show. We'd have to really do set up some credibility for us by inviting those guys. All right, Matt, welcome back. I'm excited to work through this. And go through this big sort of migration discussion because we left off. Brandon, I know we've got some bullets that we left off at, but one of the things that stuck with me yesterday, or not yesterday, but it stuck with me last week was this persona mapping. I thought persona mapping was one thing that I came away with from the show, and I think we've got the bullet from the last show down below. But persona mapping to me, I thought was pretty interesting as you go through your organization as a way to really start to break up what you need for individuals, what you need for locations, what you need to really think about a migration. And again, think about it in a whole different way. We were on yesterday, Brandon, what kind of organization was it? It's a pretty large healthcare nonprofit organization we were on with yesterday. And we went through some pretty decent detail about coming off of an Avaya. And again, some of the things that I was thinking about rang back to last week because I said, what does this look like from a persona mapping perspective? And that was like a bell that, typical PBX guys don't go through that exercise. And why don't they go through that exercise? Well, because it's an extension to them. It's just an extension. And in fact, one of the questions was, when I take my phone with me to another location, and I'm like, dude, why would you do that? Like, you just have to sign in to, if you need a physical device, you just got to sign in. You don't need to drag a phone with you because in the old days, it's so much more difficult to re-provision another phone at a different location. It's like, just drag your phone with you and plug that sucker in, right? Well, you don't have to go through that with Teams. So anyway, we've got a lot to catch up on. Brandon, what was your favorite pull away from last week?
My favorite poll, of course, I'm definitely the technical one. I think between the two, the more technical one between the two of us. Sorry, I wasn't trying to take a dig. I could if you want me to on air. No, I think like as we were getting into, the stages of, okay, you've done your persona mapping, you've got your communication out there, you're beginning the proof of concept and maybe even pushing into the pilot program. We really didn't dip into what are some of those challenges. And I think this is going to be my favorite part, is talking about, as you move forward, you move the plan forward, you move the project forward. What are the gotchas? Like, what are the aha moments? And again, I say it's my favorite part. We didn't really talk about it, but in my mind, I was setting that stage. And I think I mentioned that at the end of the show that I wanted to talk about it because I see this every day, all day with our implementation teams, where we start turning up these enterprises. And no matter how much planning we think we've done with our customer and how much planning the customer thinks they've done, it's like probably 90% of the time, especially on the larger enterprises, there's always the aha moment, like, oh man, how did we miss that? Or why isn't this working? So I think this at least this topic in this show is going to be probably one of my favorite topics to talk about as we in this show talk about, okay, we've gone from pilot, or we're moving from pilot into the first waves of production. So maybe we just start to dive in, like, what does it look like to go from what are some of the challenges maybe you experienced in POC and pilot, if there was any big things, and then what does it look like to roll out now to get to day one, where you wake up and it's Teams day one for everybody.
Hold on, before you even get there, I want to preface that for just a second. As you're migrating off of a physical system, are you I'm curious as to what camp you're in here, because I think there's two ways to look at this. If you're pulling data out of a system, take it Avaya, Cisco, whatever it may be, right? Are you let me pull all the data out of this system and sift through all the 20 years worth of stuff that I've got in there? Or are you a Greenfield, how are we using it? I've mapped out what's in production today for the most part, not looking at what's in the Avaya today as an example. Or are you, look, let's go Greenfield, let's start clean, and let's go address the business issues as we go down. I know there's kind of a blend in there, a hybrid, but I'd like to know, what camp would you prefer to be in if you had your preference?
Great question. It's come up in every deployment. It's always a challenge. 100% Greenfield. It's my preference.
Yes!
A lot of, and that can be, so my experience has been, you get a lot of people who are going to question that. Hey, what if we forget something? Well, we have personas. We forget something, we figure out which persona they fall into and which configuration they go into. Definitely going Greenfield. I mean, also, when you're looking at these older PBXs, Avias, Cisco's and stuff, a lot of the data, depending on your organization, although I haven't seen anybody do it really, really well, is not always accurate, because it was the extension was tied to a physical phone. So when Matt Carlson leaves and somebody else comes and replaces me, that phone still works. So is there really any ticket that needs to be open to update to know who it's going to? What's great is once you move to Microsoft Teams, everything, right, has a source of truth, which is your Microsoft tenant. You know exactly which person, which email address is associated to each DID, and that makes life so much easier once you move over. But it's the getting there that a lot of times you get stumbled on, you stumble over, because you're exporting that data. You're saying, oh, well, this just says kitchen phone. Like, where, like, what kitchen? Like, where does that go? Right. Like, but as you start to rebuild that in Teams, now you've got a resource account. You can use naming conventions, to help designate those types of phones. You've got, users' email addresses associated for user phones. So it becomes easier once you're there, but I definitely prefer Greenfield, almost like a rip the Band-Aid method. Hey, we know we're going to have stuff we've got to fix. That's okay. It's so much easier now to provision once everybody knows the process. They know which workflows to follow for which scenario, which persona. Definitely some cleanup and auditing that needs to be done along the way. But I think it's a great opportunity to do it for a migration like this. One thing I forgot to bring up in one of our previous episodes, we were talking about cost, benefits of moving to teams. And of course, organizations are always, the decision makers are going to be looking at the cost. We talked about like the efficiencies and the savings that you can get from not only the telcos, but then the actual service itself, whether it's direct routing or operator connect or DRAS or something like that. So you're going to see, almost certainly, you're going to see cost savings, not only from the telco when you take that opportunity to renegotiate your contracts, whatever you may do, switch providers, and then your managed service or just your service in general is almost always going to be cheaper from a team's perspective. But another opportunity, which is huge and kind of plays into that question, is using this opportunity to actually understand and right size your environment. So every migration that I've done, I've almost always cut at least 30% of the DIDs or the extensions that we're provisioning, because some people just got a phone just for the sake of getting a phone in the past, and you just kept it there always in perpetuity. And so a lot of what you asked me in the first episode, what are my numbers at today? And they weren't enormous. They were growing, rapidly. But part of that was because we're taking the time to methodically understand, do you actually need a phone? Because a lot of knowledge workers may not need a phone. They may not communicate externally with people, but they always had an extension just because that's just what happened when you got onboarded. So I think seeing the value out of those three opportunities to save money is enormous. I mean, you think cutting your PSTN usage and DID costs by 30%, usually at a minimum, in my experience, can be a driver all on its own, let alone the additional benefits that you're getting from it.
So that makes me curious about your, maybe just in your current environment, your current role. Do you see value in shared calling? Are you using shared calling to help in that reduction where, okay, people don't really need a number, but maybe they still have these certain, I'll call them workflows, like a vendor maybe still needs to get a hold of a group, but really it's ad hoc. Like, do you see value in that? Are you using it?
I see the value. I'm not using it yet. It's something I'm really looking into. I think it's gotten a lot more mature over the last 6 months. I think it becomes difficult for a very large organization because my first, the number one benefit, shared calling, great. Don't have a single DID per user, great. Make outbound calls, great. I think where it becomes complicated for me at such a large enterprise is, and the thing that I worry about is, how am I going to handle the inbound calls? I know, of course, auto attendance and directories and whatnot is probably the typical way that smaller organizations do it. So that's kind of that inbound calling, really getting those auto attendants dialed in and maintaining them, right? Because if you're talking about, hundreds of thousands of users, you're probably not going to have a single directory for all 100,000, right? So now am I splitting it up by building, by state, by city? So like those things have been kind of not a blocker, but my only hesitancy from doing it, and really figuring that out. And that's just on me to really kind of hone that in and figure out the right path forward. But the value is certainly there, and it's something that's been discussed. Yeah.
Okay. And there's not a lot of carriers that provide that today. Like other providers out there, like Operator Connect providers, really haven't figured out the model for that, right? They really haven't kind of said, okay, here's a model that works for us. Everybody's always after the MRR, the monthly recurring revenue component, and they want either per user or per trunk with some DID. So they're after that MRR, where if you look at shared calling, as an example, we knew early on, we were probably one of the first ones to do shared calling. And it was really almost, I call it like a freemium offering, because it's not free, but it's like a low entry, low barrier to entry, way to kind of, bring customers on. Because, the biggest thing about doing business with a larger organization, Matt, and you can tell me if you think this is true or not, but is going through an MSA process. Going through an MSA process and onboarding a large organization. It's like once we do business with a larger organization, it's like they just continue to buy and buy and buy from us.
Yeah.
And this is a plug for Momentum at this point. Sorry about that, but we'll just go through it real quickly because we do network and we do all these other value added services for organizations in the communications realm. So you get them on board with a simple thing like shared calling where it's just consumption, real simple consumption, make it easy, let it spread a little bit. Invariably, what you just said happens, right? Hey, I need to handle inbound calling differently. What does that look like? Well, that makes it's a user, it's a trunk, it's a this now. And now we get into, into the services that are for a telecom company more predictable versus the usage component. I'm not even going to say the usage component isn't as profitable. It's actually quite profitable, the usage component of it, right? If you're saying from a per minute basis, right? Now, it may not be if you go put 10,000 users on, you're only billing $98. You kind of go, dang, that's 10,000 users on there. It's only $98. But at some point, that usage either climbs up or that organization comes back to us and says, hey, we need to consume some of this stuff. Can you help us with this? And that's really what makes shared calling a value-added service that we offer. And it's because of that. It drives more consumption. It is like a freemium sort of model for us.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole episode on shared calling. I think just the last point for that for me, from a technical standpoint, I haven't seen some of the operator connect models and the DRAS models be able to adapt to that very well from a SIP trunk standpoint, because typically with an individual DID subscribed to a user, you're oversubscribing your concurrent call paths to some extent for DRAS or just direct routing in general. But that starts getting a little complicated with shared calling, I feel like, because unless they're able to dynamically scale their call paths, now you potentially run into the issue where now you're out of concurrent calls. And what's the good model for oversubscribing those call paths based on your usage? And some of that is just going to be learned through your own organizational usage of it. But I think it's a challenge. It's like if you go to calling plans, they don't really have that, right? Because it's Microsoft, they can scale infinitely, really. And I was told that they don't really have a limit. You're paying for the minute consumption, but as far as the call paths, they don't necessarily have a limit. So it makes calling plans for shared calling sound pretty lucrative. But so just some of the things that I've noticed. Yeah.
Interesting. So this is exactly why we built the product the way we built the product, shared calling, right? And it's for you, it's hands off. It's not via your SBCs. It's Operator Connect for us. It's Operator Connect. Here you go, Operator Connect. And that's something that's managed on the carrier side, right? Because we've got grundles and grundles of capacity because what we do. And so you look at that, you go, that's what makes this a simple sort of, that's not something for you to worry about as an enterprise, right? That's behind the scenes on a carrier level to support the level of oversubscription. And speaking of oversubscription, Matt, just out of pure, this is great for the technical guys out there. When you're talking about an oversubscription model, what does that look like for you typically? If you're, if you're a larger organization, we see about between 50 and 100 to 1 is kind of what we see. What's been your experience?
A lot lower. I'm not saying it's necessarily warranted, but we typically do somewhere around like a 15 to 20 to 1.
Oh, wow.
Oversubscription rate. Yeah. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that we need that capacity, but that's just what we're currently doing.
Yeah, just kind of roll. I mean, like in the UCAS days, it was like 25, right? You said 20 to 25. In the team space, it's been a little bit. It's been higher for us, certainly, just because you've got a lot of subscribers sitting on the network, right?
Yeah.
And you look at that and you go, man, it's and we don't sell it on a concurrent call session basis. Typically, it's unless it's a GCCH high type of customer.
Yeah.
It's usually per user. And so we end up driving that per user cost way down, but it's a pretty significant oversubscription these days, just because.
And I think
Yeah.
I think that oversubscription model changes in Microsoft and really any of the collaboration platforms, because now it's teams to teams calling is going to be
Correct. Yeah.
the
It's your
rental of your calls.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that is pretty low, and it sounds like from you guys, based on your practices too, there's probably room there, but for us to oversubscribe more. But yeah, that's just kind of what we started at. It was just what was offered to us. So yeah, that's where we've been at. But yeah, definitely good points there.
I think
Hey,
that
guys,
that's well,
go ahead.
I was gonna segue. I think that's a great segue back onto this whole journey to how do you go from that POC pilot into production? And one of the talking points that we have down is that KPI, the metrics, understanding the trends, and so my thought is, as we ratchet 20 minutes into this episode, we probably want to start talking about what this looks like for you, right? We're pilot, we're going into wave one of production. Let's get to production. Let's talk about the hurdles. Let's talk about the things you're looking at, the success metrics, all of these things that get you to a successful day one. Sorry, Rick, I
Yeah.
didn't interrupt you.
No, good. You're good.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, great topic. Right. Yeah. So, just a couple gotchas that we kind of I've seen along the way. A lot of companies that I've migrated were coming off of Skype for Business at some point in the past. So, a big one that's got me during one migration was those on-prem line URI fields being populated. So that was a nightmare getting to the bottom of that. And this was in the very early stage, early days of Teams Voice. Why is this attribute not writing? So that was a big one. So definitely recommend, if you've got any old legacy attributes there from Link or Skype for Business, getting rid of those and making sure that your attributes are going to set correctly. That's probably a big one for me.
Interesting that you brought that up as topic number one. We actually just saw this week in a customer we've been deploying for a few weeks. They were an on-prem Cisco customer, moving them to Teams, and they've kind of flipped over their management, which in turn flips over some of the IT personnel. So we're in probably what we're about to talk about, this wave one of production, right? Pilot's done, POC's done, pilot's done. We're in wave one production. And just this week, like Monday or Tuesday, we find out that wave one just face planted. We ported the numbers. We go to activate. Implementation team gets stuck. Errors all over the place. Line URI isn't taking the config.
Yeah.
And we had to bring in one of our architects, so to speak. Did some digging. Come to find out, this customer had trialed or tested or done
At
something
one point,
with Link.
Yeah.
With a Link
And-
server on-prem, and
Yep.
everybody for the
Yep.
management, the teams changed out. Nobody realized it was in their 80,
10
environment
years ago.
10 years
Totally.
ago, and
Exactly.
it
Yeah.
bit us hard. And
Yeah.
so I'm glad you brought that up as the very first point, because it's still super relevant, even for customers who maybe they've forgotten that they, or didn't know because they're newer to the company, that they didn't have a Link service or a Skype for Business service, set up, and they're still coming from an on-prem. Yeah, it can bite.
Yeah.
It can bite.
Yeah. I think another one too, I think probably the second one for me is going to be, if you're managing your SBC in-house and you were previously using that same SBC for other configurations, is making sure that, we talked about it last episode, right, where you're testing all the different scenarios. I've run into during one particular deployment where everything seemed to be working, but try to transfer a call externally, right? Like transfer an external call to an external phone number. And that, then either the call would fail or you get one-way audio or something. So I think, during your pilot phase, and it's really critical to test those out, because I've run into that during production waves as well, where we forgot to test some weird scenario, right? Like a warm transfer to an external phone number. Now the SIP headers get translated differently, and you've got to adjust that at the SBC level. I've never had that experience, using a direct routing as a service provider or similar, right? Those guys, that's all they do, right, for every customer. So they've got their dedicated SBCs. They know how to configure them correctly. But if you're using, if you happen to have a team certified SBC and now you're configuring that for direct routing, I think it's super critical to make sure that you're testing all of those things out and finding those challenges where you've got to modify, whatever it may be on your SBC side to make sure that you account for all those scenarios. I've run into that during production deployments as well.
And I'm going to echo that. I have a motto that I've lived by for many years in my career. I learned it from someone else in the voice industry, is the importance of know your call flow. And to your point, like test. Point number 2, I'm going to just hit you up with another real world example. And the reason I'm doing this is to stress, like, what you're saying is super valid and it's super relevant. It's real. We had another customer, US based company, service turned up, everything's great. Now they want to add their European branch to the service. We bring in their international numbers. We tell customer, okay, numbers have ported. Please test and let us know. We'll validate your call flows. They test, come back to us and say everything's good. So we walk away, and shame on us. We should have still validated. Fast forward a couple days, all of a sudden trouble tickets come rolling in, and we start looking, and these calls are failing, and we're like, what on earth? Turns out that a U.S. person has tested calling over to Europe. This happened to be into like France, so it's French speaking. They got a French message and just assumed it was the auto attendant, and they hung up. And really what it was the carrier release message
rejecting the call
because there was a configuration wrong. And it was like, again, know your call flow, the importance of understanding what your call flows are and validating them. Like, I can't stress that enough. Like, to your point, in the SBC, validate the technical piece.
Speaking of testing, really quickly, Matt, I know you've got a couple of things for us that you've promised, Matt. You've promised these things, so I'm gonna hold you to them. We've got a persona map that we're offering. It's free. It's down below. Click on the link. That's cool. But do you have a test plan? Do you have a test plan that you go through?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. I think I can get you that too. Yeah. So we can provide that. Again, super critical to find all, and they seem redundant. And when you talk to like maybe your more traditional telephony guys, they're going to be like, come on, like, this is why, whatever the case is. But yeah, there's definitely some things that you need to test that are specific to teams. And then just your standard call flow, available options to you. I mentioned this in episode number 1. You have so many ways you can route your phone number, simultaneously ring, external phones, like all this great stuff that's available to you. Got to make sure you're testing that out, because the way that it's handled on the SBC side, you just got to make sure that it's accounted for, and make sure that you're not surprised later on. Like, why would somebody do this? Well, they can. So you got to make sure we account for it, right? So.
I love the free tools. The free tools are amazing, especially for you enterprises out there that are considering this, listening to this episode or the previous episodes, right? Having the tools at your fingertips that are used in a massive migration over and over, the persona mapping sort of spreadsheet, if you will, a test plan. I mean, these are just like rock solid, amazing tools, Matt. We appreciate that. Down below, guys.
Okay, so you've run into some challenges, you've addressed them, you live and learn, right? You're on your 3-peat as far as migrations go. So these are things that you keep in mind. Very good advice for the other enterprises looking to move to teams. All right, so we're pilot, we're moving to production. What's it take for that wave 1? Like what's next to get from pilot to wave 1 to day 1?
Yeah. So scripting is going to be a big one, right? Whether it's using a consultant that has the expertise, or you really hone in those skills, upskill people internally to understand PowerShell. Probably have already internal people that are familiar with PowerShell, not specifically on the voice side, but just in general using the PowerShell module. So that's my preferred method. There's some great tools out there that, if you're going with some type of like automation management platform, they can handle those really well and do a lot of error handling and checking and whatnot. I like to start with having some form of pre-check. So we've got our list of users that we're migrating. We've got our corresponding DIDs that are being assigned to them. Making sure that we know the specific policy. Large organizations, you're going to have multiple regions where you may have different dial plans. You may have voice routing policies that may be different, whatnot. So I think it's a lot of validation there. I like to run some form of a pre-check via PowerShell. So checking certain attributes that I know have come up, like those on-prem things. I want to see those. I want to make sure they're blank. I want to make sure that they're not islands mode users, right? And they're teams only. That's another, probably a big one that's related to that first point I brought up, which is if you've got islands mode users, you got to make sure that you're all over in teams only mode. So doing those types of pre-checks, even a week in advance, honestly, because you need time to remediate if you do find anything. So doing those pre-checks, making sure everything looks good, simple stuff that is easy to forget sometimes. If you're using add-on licenses, do you got enough licenses allocated in your tenant, right? So things like that, the easy stuff that we sometimes forget about because we get so bogged down in the weeds that we get distracted, right, from the simple things. So doing those types of pre-checks, super critical, and then you move into your actual enablement day.
So two things. Sorry, I'm gonna keep bouncing off of you. Two things. I think the pre-check, that's a big one. I've stressed it before to our service delivery and implementation team. This is for anyone. Like, we can always do better with pre-checks, and I've stressed that. Like, auditing your data is super critical as you stage for that maintenance window for that execution. Because I would say, this is just my perspective. I always expect fallout even on the day of production.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, when I throw that script in and I start running it, even with all the pre-checks that I think I've done, I'm going to expect some fallout. And to your point, making sure you're doing error handling, making sure that you're not blowing up configs mid-flight just because you forgot to account for that. So very important there. Love that I would stress that pre-check and data validation. And then this is totally more of a plug of a update I saw from Microsoft. That's, I don't know if it's out yet or if it's coming, on the licensing, that now nested auto attendants and call queues do not need a resource account. That's huge.
That was a big one.
Big. Yeah. So that's huge because man, those get so overly complicated with having to license and create a resource account for every single nested auto attendant. I mean, even your most basic call flow is probably going to have two voice apps, right? You've got your auto attendant for business hour routing and messaging, whatever you need to do there, your options. And then you're going to have at least, more than likely, one call queue underneath that, even in the most basic form. So now you've only got to worry about the resource account for the top level, unless you need like a direct phone number to the call queue or something of that nature. But yeah, so that's a big simplification that they added.
Yeah, I think it's huge. We see customers, and they're not even as big as the entities you're working at or have worked at, where we've got one that it's purely for analytic reasons, that they don't have a big user base, but they've got like 50 call queues because they're trying to report, it's some kind of state, local government that's trying to do some kind of reporting for funding or whatever, where they want to bring a call in, and it's likely going to go to the same person or same 5 people every time in every call queue, but they need to tag that call in a way that allows them to see, okay, this is where the call came from. And the resource account, to your point, that management is a complete nightmare. So this is a big, really good change for Microsoft.
I reposted that a few days ago. I just put the link for down below for Bailey to help us post to post. But I reposted that because it said it was Miguel Contigera that said, it's a small change, but welcomed. I'm like, that's kind of a big deal. That's pretty cool. Let's put it out there.
Yeah, those can get super cumbersome, and then managing them and get a recommendation there, get a naming convention in place and stick with it. I like to do like AA underscore or CQ underscore at the start as a prefix, because that it searches. If you want to filter all of your auto attendants or call queues, you can filter by searching those first three, and then come up with some naming convention that you stay consistent with to help with the man. Even with these now not needing multiple ones, it still will help with the management later on.
Totally echo that.
I'm interested in getting to Matt. This is, we've gotten to day one. Let's say you're working up. We're working up to day one. All the things that you got to go through to day one. By the way, I'm going to say this really quickly. This is where a managed service provider really helps, right? This is where, if you've got a managed service provider to help you kind of through that as an organization, that's pretty awesome. Lean on them. Right, lean on them, and they're doing your pre-checks for you, and you do your own, but they're doing your pre-checks for you. They're doing all this sort of granular work, because if a customer is listening to it, it sounds real complex, but for someone that does it all day, every day, in the MSP world, I think it's pretty nice to basically lean on your partner there. But I want to get to this day one thing, because we've talked about you're in day one production, or you've moved some numbers over, because I really want to kind of get to how does that scale now? You've gone through this, this day one. So let's talk day one, and then let's talk scale, because cadence, I think, is important for people to understand, because it's not let me move all my users over, right? There's going to be a cadence associated with what you're doing. And I think that cadence often is dependent upon how day one goes. So what does day one look like now? Everyone's moved over. 6 a.m. comes around. Maybe you've opted for a morning port, or in fact, what do you prefer? You prefer a morning port, evening port? What's your preference?
Yeah,
there?
I typically prefer like a Friday afternoon port, only because usually that's you've got your folks not working on the weekends. But it's going to be business dependent. Even within your enterprise, it's going to it may be dependent based on the individual business's needs. So morning ports, if it's a day of kind of deal, definitely prefer that. Like I said, if it's acceptable, I like to do the Friday afternoon, because that gives plenty of time to do all of your testing and call into your auto attendants and your call queues, make sure everything's working correctly. You've also got to, once you port them over, depending on where they're coming from, after you port, you've got to assign those phone numbers, right? So typically, like, I'd assign a test phone number, have a point of contact verify for that line of business that, hey, this is working correctly, by calling the test phone number. And then you've got to update the actual resource account's phone number to reflect the production number. So
Interesting about the Friday. I want to give you the carrier side of this really quickly, and I don't want to take time for the carrier side of it. But a Friday night port is the worst, and I'm going to tell you why. And it actually is not bad. But what I'll say is we've always pushed customers away from that kind of a thing, only because there is no in the porting departments don't work like normal support does, right? So not necessarily our porting department, but let's say losing carrier department, right? It's not something that's done 24/7, right? So when you lose that concurrent potential support, should something go wrong, all right? There's a what is it called? A win back. There's a win back process. Snapback. Thank you. The snapback process that could be enabled if the support team is there, or if the porting team is still around, that sort of thing. So we've always pushed away or shied away from a Friday evening port in particular, because now let's say you figure something's wrong on Friday night, and now it's like you're going to the support team of the losing carrier or the winning carrier, and the winning carrier may be there with you, but the losing carrier may be like, that's not something that we support right now. It's like that department's closed. So we're waiting until Monday morning at 5 a.m. before we can address this, as an example. And we're like, oh man, everybody's sweating bullets at that point, right?
Yeah.
So anyway.
And I'm going to pile on, and I'm going to challenge, maybe not challenge, but I'm going to give you some, when I say you, our listeners, something to chew on. This is just something I've experienced, and some of it is from Microsoft perspective. We all love to affectionately call it the Microsoft Minute. I'll get to that in a second. And then the importance of understanding the migration, where you're coming from to get to Teams, because I've become a big proponent that if you can pre-stage the configuration in Microsoft well ahead of the port, without really impacting the business, it mitigates challenges with the back to the Microsoft Minute. Two things that I've seen is, it's kind of like cross fingers and toes, especially if it's big scripting changes that you're doing with PowerShell. A lot of times they sync and it's, a couple minutes and you're done. Other times, Matt, I'm sure you can speak to this with plenty of experience, that 24 hours later, you're like, where is my config? And so on that note, I've actually gotten to a point where I do not recommend customers port on a Monday morning. And the reason why is it seems like Monday mornings are the worst day to get synced, like quick syncs with Microsoft. And I don't know if Monday is typically just a high traffic day from a telco perspective. And I assume that also means you have systems under load, generally speaking. So I just imagine that lots of people, you got your onboarding of new employees, these big enterprises just slamming Microsoft Monday morning to do what they need to do. And then you've got telcos at the same time slamming Microsoft with ports and config changes on behalf of the enterprise. So that's just kind of my feedback is I'm not saying don't do it on a Monday. I would steer clear of Monday based on my experience. And then two, if at all possible, if you can pre-stage those changes on the team's phone side the night before or the day before, I would really, really recommend that, because it gives you time to sync. You can do some, if you have your own SBCs or you have a partner who can help you test, you can actually validate some of those call flows way ahead of time and know that it's the right number, not a test number, and things pending the success of the port, you're just mitigating risk, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're doing direct routing, you can even assign, the last I checked, you can even straight assign a phone number directly to somebody without it actually being ported over. So exactly. There's certainly things you can do ahead of time that help mitigate some of those factors. Yeah.
Now, I say all that, Operator Connect kind of like, unless you have a carrier who's willing to pre-stage those numbers from an Operator Connect because it's programmatic, which we can do, some operators aren't going to play that game with you.
Totally. FYI. Yeah, and calling plans, forget about it.
Yeah. Okay, so Matt, day one, is everybody on board? Is everybody in IT like all hands on deck? We're waiting for it. Let's not talk theoretical at this point. I want to go. What did you experience? Was it different than your first two and your third one here? What's day one look like now, and what did you actually experience?
Yeah, day one, always stressful, nervous. Set up the war room, right? All day meeting for everybody who needs to be there, who would potentially need to be there. Set it up, use that as your real time chat. You can hop right into the meeting if an issue comes up. And then it's getting a feel for it. You're going to learn real quick. Keep close contact with your help desk. Pay attention to even the smallest ticket that might be related, because it could be a early warning of a bigger problem. So make sure you're really in tune with the help desk. You're monitoring any incoming tickets for anything, really. You make a big change like this, testing on your own, reach out to friendly folks, make sure that they're seeing what they make sure they're not seeing any issues. Check in with your stakeholders, make sure that they're not seeing anything, they don't have any big complaints coming through. Try to get ahead of some of those problems. Don't let them come to you. And then, if you have access to, looking at utilization, over the first 24 hours, 48 hours, start looking and see, are people making phone calls, right? Are you seeing, actual phone calls that are going through lasting, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, right? Across a bunch of users, and really don't let those problems come to you. Be proactive, try to reach out. You're going to know who your stakeholders are, who your noisy folks are. Reach out to them, make sure that there's no issues, because last thing you want to do is have a giant problem fall in your lap and you had no indication. Well, why didn't we know? Like, well, what were you doing to find out, to proactively look for these? So you've got to be out there. You got to proactively get out there and talk to your users.
And how have yours gone? Like your last one, how did your last day one go?
Great, honestly. we've got it down to a science now that we know the environment. Because of all the things that we've talked about up to this point, we know the environment, we know the issues that we're going to run into, we've mitigated them, or we've resolved them. They go without a hitch. I mean, really, they're smooth sailing at this point. Rinse and repeat. Do your pre-checks, do your migration, do your post-checks. Run scripts to make sure that what you think you set is actually what you did set. Compare that to your source of truth of what should be set, and do all of those checks and balances. And yeah, they go without a hitch now.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. Even the porting today, people have this big misconception that porting is such a big, daunting thing to do, right? And for those not in the telco space, right, porting is literally a database change. That's what porting number is a database change. It's run as a script now, and you go through, the script runs through, and the batch of numbers goes through, and you're like, okay, there's 10,000 numbers, and we're changing the database sort of. Man, what is it called, Brandon? Is it SPID? I think it's a SPID is what I think it's called.
Well, SPID, but LRN, the routing number to tell it how it needs to route.
And so you're changing that in the database, and that's really it, right? It's telling the world where to redirect these calls to now, and how to who to direct these calls to. So when you've got everything pre-staged like you're talking about, you've got everything preloaded like you're talking about, and how you talked about not on calling plans, but a carrier that will do this with you, where you've got everything preloaded, and the port happens, and it's a non-event, right? It is, yeah. It's a non-event these days. So that's pretty cool. So let's your latest one, just without a hitch. You've got the systems down, you've got the process down, you've done this before now. This is your third time. What is an appropriate cadence, you think? Let's say you've got an organization of 10,000 people, right? So that's a big organization, not the hugest out there, because Microsoft's got 150,000 users, 200,000 users, but 10,000 users, between 5 and 10,000 users, is a pretty solid number that you see in organizations that we work with from a OC perspective. So, what's the proper cadence, you think? If you've done all this pre-work, and you've done all this setup, and you've gone through, and you've experienced the day one migration that's nice and smooth, what would be your personal? This is not what you should do. I want your personal. What would your cadence look like?
All 10,000 at once. No, I'm kidding.
Man,
look, yeah. So yeah, I do like to split it up. I mean, regardless if you're talking about 10,000, 50,000, I don't think it's beneficial to go all at once. You do need to balance this idea that you're going to have a split environment for some amount of time. You don't want to have that going on forever, months, right? So, I would say, for those numbers, I would prefer to probably split them up into 2 or 3 waves, where you're doing, a week apart at most would be my preference. So you've got, you're not doing everybody at once. If you break something, you're not breaking it for the entire organization. Now we're confident we're not going to break anything. We've done our due diligence, testing and everything. I would say break it up, a couple waves, depending on how you feel from an operational standpoint, how comfortable the team is feeling. If there was something major unforeseen that went wrong, how are you able to mitigate that? And do you have the resources to mitigate it? So break it up in a couple waves, again, a week apart. It also gives you a little bit of time to iterate in between. You have your go, no go check-ins, the week before each wave, and you're doing all your pre-checks and all that. So yeah, break it up in a couple, depending on what you feel like. I've also done too where we've ramped it up, right? We did 1,000 week 1, we did 2,500 week 2, and then we did 5,000 week 3, because then we really felt solid. Like, okay, we did this, we felt good, we had enough time, nothing went wrong. All right, let's do 2,500. Let's ramp it up, right? And so you don't necessarily have to break them into even groups. It probably is better to do a little bit of a ramp up, just so you start getting the training wheels off and you feel more comfortable. So,
and I think Rick, you would agree with this. I think the cadence is important, because if you allow too much time to go by, you potentially create bigger problems than just getting the project done.
Yeah.
Depending on how disparate your systems are, how integrated or not they are, because now you're potentially putting teams in islands from a telephony perspective.
Yeah.
And so I think cadence is really important to take into consideration as you think through how you're going to do that migration. I think Rick and I tend to be fans of, let's go get this done. And we tend to tell customers that.
I am too. I would much rather do everybody at once, but realistically and for risk benefit, risk analysis, you got to split them up sometimes. But
and that's it.
Yeah.
100%. You said it earlier. It's the split management of the split environment. That's the biggest problem to splitting it up. If you didn't have to worry about another separate environment, it'd be easier. But I like the whole at once thing. But in a larger organization, it's never the case, right? It's always we see it split up. But doing it in a quick succession, you're not waiting for a month to do another one. You're not waiting 3 weeks to do another one. Quick succession is the right way to go about it, so that you don't have to sit there and manage the hybrid infrastructure for that long, because invariably things start to go wrong with the legacy system or with people, and confusion sets in a little bit, right? If you've got, I'm on this and I'm still on that, which one am I supposed to use? And it just becomes a bit confusing for people. So having a succession, quick succession behind that initial wave, I think you're absolutely right, Matt. That's a great way to go. So that's exciting. And is that how you kind of typically roll now? It's like, okay, let's knock these things out 1-2 weeks apart and just be done with it.
Oh yeah. I mean, now at this point, we're not doing batches large enough to warrant breaking them up. So we'll do 1,000, 2,500 at a time. No big deal. But yeah, if you've got a really large initial migration happening, totally break it up. That's exactly what I do and what I've done with all my previous deployments. SMB, those are pretty simple. A single person can really work through any issues with 100 people, right? But you've got to kind of spread out that risk a little bit more when you're talking about the enterprise level.
Yeah, very good. Well, listen, so you've got today one, you set up the cadence, and I think next week we're going to talk about what the rest of the benefits, which is really what I wanted to get to today, but we got to cut this one today. At this point, we've got to wrap up now, but the benefits now, because I really want to understand, you've ported now, and now are you seeing the benefits of Microsoft Teams right away?
Yeah.
Or are you not? Why did you even do it, right? So let's save that one for next week. At this point, Brandon, why don't you send us out? We've got a wrap.
Yeah, one last thing. I know we're wrapping up. I want to just really quickly stress the as you're going through this, Matt, you said it, look at the data, look at the trends, make sure your metrics, your KPIs, your call flows look healthy. I'm going to try to remember to drop in the chat of the episode links to things like CQD, call quality dashboard. Microsoft gives a ton of resources that I think oftentimes people aren't aware of, or it maybe seems daunting to set up, but the tools are at your fingertips. So get familiar with the reports inside Attack, and then explore opportunities around things like CQD, so that you can start to pay attention to what your traffic is doing. On that note, Matt, thank you very much for joining episode 78. Bailey, take us out.